समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
The bomb crashed through the sign of the Red Cross, painted over the spotless white roof, cutting through 2 floors of the number 3 Canadian Stationary Hospital. The surgeons Ethelbert Meek and Abner Sage died instantly, together with nurses, their operating room staff, and their critically injured patients. The fire which followed claimed many more lives. Later, military chaplain G.H. Andrews recalled, and I quote, "There were flags with a red cross flying, and lights were turned on them so that they would show prominently. The Germans could not have possibly mistaken the building they bombed for anything else." 400 people died this week when Pakistan Air Force combat jets hit the Omar Addiction Treatment Hospital in Kabul. Hideous carnage evidence that precision strike technology has done nothing to mitigate the murderous impacts of war. Little has changed, it would seem, since the destruction of the number 3 hospital, which was back in the 29th of May, 1918. Everywhere, the conventions that have sought to protect civilian lives, even in war, have been disintegrating. The bombing of hospitals in Gaza is just the most egregious example. America has hit a school in Iran. Iran has bombed hospitals in Israel. Saudi Arabia leveled another hospital in northern Yemen. The Taliban, who now rule Afghanistan, have themselves conducted suicide attacks on hospitals and terrorized doctors. Few leaders even bother to apologize for these crimes, as President Barack Obama did in 2015 after American jets hit a hospital in Kunduz, killing dozens of doctors and patients. Law scholar Peter Margill has noted that a military investigation of that bombing established commanders had shown callous disregard for human life. Yet, after the apology, nobody was prosecuted for war crimes. Ever since 1949, the Geneva Conventions have promised protection of the sick and wounded in war, whether civilian or military, friend or foe. There are circumstances in which these immunities can be lifted. For example, when a hospital is misused for military or intelligence purposes, or civilians participate in combat in some way. Even then, however, international humanitarian law states that no attack is legitimate if it causes, I quote, "loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage in civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated." Put very simply, this means a response has to be proportionate to the risk. The bombing of the number 3 hospital was very far from the greatest crime of the First World War. Large numbers of hospital ships were sunk by German submarines as part of a policy of unrestricted warfare against enemy shipping. Lieutenants Ludwig Dittmar and John Bolt, the ranking officers of the German submarine U-86, were convicted after the war of machine gunning the survivors of the hospital ship Landovery Castle. For those watching the killing, though, there was one thing that distinguished the hospital bombings from these other attacks. The end was pure and simple death, not military victory. The answer, some argued, was counter-savagery. They will do what they think they can with impunity, and they will avoid that which entails punishment, wrote the novelist Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle had a very clear idea of what punishment meant. He wanted German cities to be bombed and for prisoners of war to be picketed amidst hospitals to deter attack. Even though many shared Doyle's rage, some warned that his prescription would lead only to greater savagery. The eminent historian Arnold Toynbee, in a famous pamphlet on crimes committed during the German invasion of Belgium in 1915, argued for careful documentation of events as a foundation for future efforts to ensure legal accountability. Leonard Hobhouse, a trenchant critic of British imperialism, said that the dangers of sacrificing ethical principles in the pursuit of national objectives were very great and would cost even the idea of justice itself. These warnings were mostly ignored. The bombing of cities in the First World War became the template for the even greater savagery of the Second World War and its great legacy of tragedy and killing. Learning from the Nazi genocide of the Second World War, the world seemed to move towards making war subject to law and reason. These ends were, however, almost immediately subverted. The Western Allies, driven by anti-communism, eagerly rehabilitated Nazis as well as Imperial Japanese war criminals. For their part, the Soviets pursued exactly the kinds of means of industrialized mass killing that they condemned during the Second World War. A grim pursuit that was revealed after dozens died in an anthrax outbreak, later traced to a secret bioweapons laboratory. For the most part, the Second World War effort to hold nation-states accountable for their military actions died during the Cold War. Large-scale massacres of civilians during the Korean conflict, like the slaughter at Nogun-ri, as well as the execution of civilians and prisoners by the North, went unpunished. The war in Korea, by some inevitably controversial expert estimates, claimed more civilian deaths as a percentage of the population than the Second World War before it or the Vietnam War after. The scholar Kelly Greenhill has argued that civilian deaths in modern conflicts have been systematically underreported, undermining hopes that war had somehow been tamed. To conclude that efforts to impose restraint and rules on the conduct of war are therefore useless, though, would be misguided. The violation of traffic laws, for example, does not mean that there is no purpose served by having such norms and regulations. The philosopher Michael Walzner argued in a very famous 1977 book that the challenge was for humans to carefully consider when wars were just and to subject themselves to those principles. Following the Second World War, though, the great powers abandoned even the pretense of subjecting themselves to the rules they had just arrived at. The compelling evidence that American troops had massacred civilians at My Lai, gathered among others by the United States House of Representatives, did not lead to the imprisonment of the perpetrators. Nothing was done. Former Senator Bob Kerrey publicly admitted to murdering more than a dozen villagers in Vietnam in cold blood, and that includes women and children. But neither he nor others in his unit faced any legal consequences. The savageries of apartheid South Africa and Angola and Mozambique, the carpet bombing of Afghan villages during the Soviet intervention, America's secret support of genocidal wars in South America, and its in full public view destruction of Fallujah in Iraq, each of these diminished brick by brick hopes that people everywhere might be saved at least some of the horror of war. Leaders these days have begun to claim that brutality is just an organic element of conflict, like the stench, I guess, of decomposing bodies and gunpowder and amputated limbs. The American Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is fond of quoting General William Sherman, who declared in an 1879 speech that war is hell. The general, though, also made clear that war was a choice, not an inevitability. Wars do not usually result from just causes, but from pretexts, he said in a speech to cadets in 1879. There probably never was a just cause why men should slaughter each other by wholesale, but there are such things as ambition, selfishness, folly, madness in communities as well as individuals. General Sherman's words, not mine. The purpose of war is not the annihilation of enemies, but to secure some strategic end, ends which may be driven by hubris or greed, or have some bearing on justice and human progress. There are militaries, true, which have demonstrated that war does not have to descend into mindless killing. The Pakistan army, which disgraced itself in 1971, had showed respect for civilian lives in 1965. The Indian army is guilty of many crimes in counterinsurgency, but never once resorted to the kinds of massive killing and bombardment unleashed by so many other countries. Little consequence, more likely than not, will face Pakistan's generals for their crime, and it is that in Kabul. The killing of recovering drug addicts in a country ruled by an Islamist despotism is not something that will diminish America's favorite field marshal in the eyes of a president who sees no ill in bombing civilians himself. To kill without moral burden, though, seduces. As the horror of two world wars recedes from our memories, leaders and nations see ever less reason to place shackles on their own power. Lacking restraint either on technology of lethality or the ends to which these technologies are used, we have lurched dangerously close to a state which threatens not just life, but the survival of civilization. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.